Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I pay tribute to the honourable gentleman for St Helens North and his excellent campaign, and I echo many of the sentiments that he expressed in his superb speech that he just delivered to this House. I'd also like to express my gratitude to my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, for all his work and efforts since his appointment to focus on victims and to put their rights front and centre. And I'm also extremely grateful to the Home Secretary for her work, again, focusing on the rights of victims, which is perhaps something we have not traditionally put so centre stage. And this government does itself proud to be making such a commitment to victims. And this bill is an example of that desire to put victims front and centre. So, of course, I welcome this bill and I understand the rationale behind it and I support it. But I would like to make some remarks that I should be most grateful if ministers would consider. And those remarks relate to the role of the parole board, as the honourable gentleman opposite alluded to just a short moment ago. Now, of course, placing a statutory duty on the parole board to ensure that this issue is considered, the issue of non-disclosure is properly considered, is a positive step and a very, very welcome gesture. But this bill will not fundamentally change current practice of the parole board. Families in these cases will have to still rely on the discretion of the parole board, and this does raise some questions, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the role of the parole board when it comes to the interests of victims. We've heard already this afternoon about concerns of accountability and transparency of the parole board, and there are clearly around responsibilities to victims some gaps in their duties. In the light of recent quite high-profile cases, for example, the Warboys case, there was quite clearly a loss of confidence by the public in the parole board. And there is a real need for the law to be seen to be on the side of victims. And yes, that's exactly what this bill seeks to achieve. But in relying solely on the discretion of the parole board, it doesn't quite achieve that. In the Warboys case, the parole board decided in January 2018 to release this serial offender early after only 8 years. And the then Lord Chancellor was unable to intervene. In fact, he backed the parole board's decision, leaving it to victims to mount a judicial review, which fortunately found that there had been shortcomings in the decision-making process, and therefore they were able to require the parole board to revisit the decision. More information then came to light, and obviously Warboys was sentenced further for additional attacks. Now, a feature in the Warboys case was the failure by the parole board to notify victims of the forthcoming release of Warboys. And also a feature was that the government felt completely powerless to intervene on behalf of victims. And this isn't a one-off. The parole board is, of course, bound to balance the need to keep the public safe against the human rights law preventing arbitrary detention of offenders. That is their job, that is their duty, and that is what they do. But this bill will still allow the parole board to release an offender who has failed to disclose the known whereabouts of a victim's body or failed to disclose the identity of a child victim. And they are not bound by this bill or by any other requirement to take into consideration the rights of victims. And I would very much like ministers to consider how in future they can look at the role of the parole board and augment it to ensure that the rights of victims are also up there with the rights of offenders. Clearly, this bill will still allow a killer sentenced to life to be released even if he has failed to disclose the whereabouts of a victim's body. And most people would say that such a person may not be properly rehabilitated if he's refusing to cooperate on something as basic as the location of a victim's remains or the identity of a child. This bill, Mr Speaker, raises issues about the parole board that were actually out there and being discussed in the previous Parliament, but were not satisfactorily Madam Deputy Speaker, but were not satisfactorily addressed in the previous Parliament under previous Lord Chancellors. And I think perhaps this new government, with a new approach that we've seen so much on display by the current Lord Chancellor, perhaps we could consider how the role of the parole board could be looked at in more depth. Now, I know that there was a review of the parole board in 2018, and one of the recommendations was that the parole board should have there should be a further review into the parole board's activity, a more in-depth review to see how legislation might actually make it a more transparent and accountable and more robust. And I would very much welcome that if we could please pursue that in a little more depth, because I think we must always continue to ensure that the victims' rights are equal to the rights of the offenders. I mean, the other issue around the parole board that I would just like to touch on, in Telford right now at this moment, I've been trying to find out whether another serious perpetrator of child sexual exploitation, who was sentenced to a 26-year extended sentence in 2012, I've been trying to find out whether or not he's been released, because he was eligible for parole 7 years later in December 2019, and I cannot get an answer. And the reason I can't get an answer is because I don't know his prisoner number. Now, if I'm unable to learn if he's been released or not, the community I represent is unable to know, and the victims and their families, they want to know. And we don't want a parole board that doesn't feel that it has any duty to victims. And I think that's something we could do so much about with this new government and its commitment to victims. And I know that their families, victims' families, and the wider community would truly appreciate that. I should be delighted.
Thank you, and apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker, for being late to the start of this debate. The Liberal Democrats also welcome this bill. It is a good move, and we're glad to see it here today. The bill responds to a number of cases, and I'm pleased that the Honourable Member has been talking about the rights of victims in particular. The bill responds to a number of cases, including that of Vanessa Gregory, a nursery worker who was convicted of multiple counts of sexual abuse and taking and distributing indecent images of children, and then refused to name those victims. Would she agree with me that we need the government to take many more steps to provide support and advice to victims of sexual abuse, including by providing sustainable grant funding for specialist independent support services in relation to those who are survivors of violence against women and girls?
I thank the Honourable Member for her intervention, and I'm grateful to her for raising the rights of victims in this place, and particularly the rights of women and girls. I should be delighted to give way to my other friend.
I would just like to thank the Secretary of State for this bill. And talking about the victims of child sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, there is nothing that is better, I think, than bringing to light and holding the abuser to account for those that he has victimized, and making it, forcing them to disclose their victims takes away the power from the abuser. And that's why I think this is such a welcome bill, because it's showing that we are listening to the victims and saying you can no longer hold in your heart the secrets of the people that you've abused. And I very much welcome this, and I thank the boldness of the Secretary of State for taking this forward. And thank you.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I agree with every word that she has said. So I would like to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that as a government that is on the side of victims and their families, and that is exactly what this excellent bill intends to achieve, I just would urge ministers on the front bench to continue their good work in this arena, and to particularly place some pressure upon the parole board to focus on the rights of victims. Thank you for all your good work.